FBI agent's daughter smiled. During sentencing, Judge Caprio's response left the room. Silent. The morning sun struck Madison Avenue with a cold, clear glare, reflecting off the black armored SUV as it eased to a stop at precisely 9:02 a.m. on Tuesday, March 12, 2024. The engine hummed a low, authoritative note, a soundtrack to the small ritual of privilege that was about to unfold. The sidewalk was mostly empty, save for a few early commuters, a camera crew perched near the courthouse steps, and a cluster of reporters adjusting their microphones and notebooks. Then the door opened. Marissa Reynolds stepped out. She was 23, tall and poised, her designer coat shimmering under the brittle light. A diamond bracelet caught the sun, throwing a glittering arc across her wrist as she raised her hand in an almost casual wave. The smile on her lips was practiced, confident, bordering on smug, a careful mask that had carried her through endless invitations, dinners, and whispered promises of leniency that wealth could buy. Behind her, two legal aides flitted nervously, reminding her to stay calm and remember the cameras, while a cousin tugged at her sleeve, whispering something about her father's contacts, reinforcing that invisible safety net she had always relied on. Her presence commanded attention. Even the few reporters present instinctively straightened their notebooks and lenses, but this time they sensed something unfamiliar in the tension that hung above her like a charged wire. The courthouse doors opened and she advanced, heels clicking against polished stone, each step deliberate, a drumbeat announcing entitlement. Inside courtroom 14C, Judge Caprio was already seated, adjusting his glasses over a 63-year-old face that had seen decades of power tested and unraveled. The murmur of whispers from the gallery, the rustle of papers, the soft shuffle of shoes on linoleum, all paused as he spoke, his voice slicing through the familiarity of whispered assurances. In this courtroom, he said, eyes locking on Marissa with deliberate gravity, your father's badge does not precede the law. The words landed like stones in still water. Marissa's smile faltered for the briefest moment, a twitch in the corner of her mouth, a subtle narrowing of her eyes. For the first time, the armor of her upbringing felt slightly brittle, the invisible shield of influence and expectation no longer absolute. Her legal team exchanged quick glances, anxiety threading through their practiced calm, while Marissa's entourage stiffened. The room itself seemed to inhale, a collective pause pregnant with the collision of wealth and authority, the human reckoning that even privilege could not escape. Marissa tilted her chin slightly, as if daring the judge to repeat himself, to challenge the invisible boundary he had just drawn. With all due respect, Your Honor, she began, her tone crisp, measured, rehearsed. My father's position affords me positions of power, Caprio interrupted smoothly, without raising his voice. Do not exempt anyone from accountability. His eyes, steady and unyielding, met hers without flinch. In this room, you are a citizen. Your choices will be weighed, not your name. There was a ripple of tension. Reporters paused mid-note, pens hovering over paper. Staff exchanged subtle but telling glances, some shifting their weight, others pressing lips together to hide exhalations. Marissa's fingers tightened briefly around the strap of her bag, a motion almost imperceptible, but caught by those watching with careful attention. A single bead of sweat traced her temple, disappearing into her meticulously styled hair. Her entourage leaned forward, whispering again, soft, anxious threads of reassurance that now seemed insufficient. The calculated confidence she had carried across so many boardrooms and dinner parties suddenly felt fragile under the scrutiny of impartial eyes, under the moral weight of a courtroom that did not bend for pedigree or reputation. She swallowed once, slow, deliberate, the gesture betraying a flicker of awareness that her social currency, at least here, had limits. Marissa's glance swept across the gallery. Journalists scribbled, their eyebrows slightly raised, murmuring behind their notepads. Observers, a mix of public attendees and court staff, watched the subtle drama unfold. A wealthy, entitled young woman confronting a judge who refused to be impressed. Her lips pressed into a tighter line. Her posture, once fluid and controlled, stiffened. Even the smallest movements, the tap of a foot, the restless shift of weight, hinted at a rare vulnerability. Caprio returned to his notes, the silence stretching almost unbearably. The message was clear, implicit in the calm authority he wielded. Wealth, influence, and the echo of her father's badge could not protect her here. The tension was not loud. It was woven into the slight narrowing of eyes, the suppressed breaths, the internal calculations that Marissa could not share aloud. And then, just as quickly, she adjusted her coat, squared her shoulders, and allowed a measured smile to return, smaller, less confident, yet deliberate. She would face this moment as she had learned to face all others, poised, calculated, ready to test limits, but now shadowed by a subtle, unsettling awareness that the rules were not hers alone to bend. The stage was set, the first collision of power and law complete, and the courtroom waited, silent but alert, for the storm of the case to unfold. On February 18, 2024, at precisely 5:47 p.m., the late winter light cast long shadows along 7th Avenue, Manhattan, illuminating a scene that would soon become the centerpiece of Marissa Reynolds' legal reckoning. The street was busy with the ebb and flow of commuters, tourists, and neighborhood regulars, unaware that a private drone demonstration, planned, rehearsed, and orchestrated under the careful supervision of her team, was about to spiral into chaos. Marissa, 23, daughter of high-ranking FBI agent Thomas Reynolds, moved among her staff with effortless confidence, a subtle smirk brushing her lips as she gestured toward the hovering drone, its rotors slicing the chill air. "Perfect shot," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else, her designer gloves clasping the controller like a conductor's baton. The drone ascended, carrying the promise of a viral video, a carefully curated social media spectacle. Yet the machine, nimble but unpredictable, veered unexpectedly, jerking left and then right, its trajectory defying even the experienced hands of her operators. The crowd below had barely noticed when the first shouts erupted. Pedestrians scattered as the drone plummeted 11.6 feet, stopping only 4 inches from the head of a toddler in a red jacket clutching his mother's hand. The child's gasp, a sharp, involuntary note of terror, was followed by the metallic crash as the drone smashed through the glass facade of Café La Fiori. Shards scattered across the sidewalk, a glittering warning of negligence in motion. Patrons screamed, ducked, and fled as the cafe's bell jingled in panic. Coffee and pastries toppled in midair. Chaos had arrived. Officer Daniel Perez, NYPD, was on the scene within minutes, clipboard in hand, breath visible in the crisp air, eyes scanning the debris. The drone fell exactly 11.6 feet, he testified months later in Courtroom 14C, landing within 4 inches of a miner's head. Property damage totaled $22,350. No fatalities, but a near miss with potential for serious injury. His voice, precise and measured, contrasted the emotional turbulence he had witnessed, but the gallery could feel the gravity behind the numbers, the human stakes etched into every statistic. Witnesses described the panic with visceral clarity. Maria Alvarez, owner of the cafe, recalled the deafening scream of shattering glass, the sudden surge of bodies, and the stinging cuts from fragments of tempered glass. "I thought someone was trying to hurt us," she said, eyes glistening. A retired postal worker, Mr. Thomas Nguyen, recounted reflexively, shielding a child in his arms as debris showered the pavement. Their recollections were punctuated with pauses, the weight of near trauma heavy in the courtroom air. Each testimony a mirror, reflecting the consequences of reckless privilege. Marissa's defense team attempted to mitigate the spectacle, citing pre-approved safety protocols and asserting that the operators were certified. "We followed every procedure," one attorney insisted, voice clipped. "Professional. The risk assessment was thorough. Any implication of negligence is overstated." Marissa herself interjected once, her tone calm but laced with subtle entitlement. "My father's oversight ensures that all safety measures were adhered to. This could have happened anywhere, and we did our due diligence." But her words collided sharply with the evidence presented. Photographs of broken glass scattered across a sidewalk, crowded with panicked pedestrians, contradicted her claims. Footage from nearby surveillance cameras captured the sudden descent of the drone, highlighting operator error, in environmental miscalculations. Officer Perez's testimony detailed ignored warning signs, rushed permit approvals, and distracted staff, all layers of preventable mismanagement that could not be softened by the weight of a last name or family influence. The courtroom murmured, a low current of disbelief and tension running through reporters, observers, and even some members of her own entourage. Marissa's carefully constructed persona, polished for social media and private circles, seemed suddenly fragile. A subtle flicker of doubt passed across her face, the briefest tightening of lips, a glance downward that betrayed unease. She attempted to maintain composure, adjusting the sleeve of her designer coat. But even the smallest gestures, clasping her hands, shifting weight, spoke volumes about the first cracks forming in her self-assured veneer. Judge Caprio, composed and unyielding, allowed the evidence to resonate, his gaze occasionally flicking to Marissa without a word. The message was implicit. Fame and familial influence did not shield her from accountability. The near injury of a child, the terror of a small business owner, and the clear trail of documented negligence were moral and legal truths impossible to obscure. By the end of the day's testimony, the gallery felt the shift. The initial glamour of a drone demonstration had been stripped away, revealing the stark human cost of recklessness amplified by privilege. Marissa, once radiant with the confidence of assumed protection, now faced a moment of quiet vulnerability under the relentless light of truth. The stage was set for confrontation, the collision of arrogance and justice poised to intensify in the chapters to come. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation, as Marissa Reynolds leaned forward in her seat, voice sharpened by equal parts frustration and entitlement. Tuesday, March 19th, 2024, 10:17 a.m. Another crisp morning in Manhattan, another day in courtroom 14C that would test the limits of privilege against the unwavering authority of Judge Caprio. Marissa's eyes scanned the room, taking in the gallery of reporters, staff, and onlookers, each face a subtle mirror reflecting the consequences she had so far only just begun to reckon with. "You call this investigation thorough?" Marissa interrupted, cutting across the prosecutor mid-sentence. The edges of sarcasm thick in her tone. "Officer Perez may have reported numbers, but what about witness credibility? Some of these statements are clearly exaggerated or secondhand. How can this court accept them as fact?" Her fingers drummed lightly on the polished wood of the defense table, each tap a quiet assertion of her presence, a calculated rhythm meant to unnerve. Judge Caprio's response was deliberate, calm, almost measured in contrast to Marissa's charged energy. "Ms. Reynolds," he began, voice steady, carrying the weight of experience and moral certainty. "Credibility is established through documentation, cross-examination, and corroboration. No social rank exempts anyone from accountability. Your father's position does not grant immunity in this courtroom. The law applies equally to all citizens." The gallery absorbed the exchange in near silence, a collective intake of breath marking the collision of worlds, entitlement versus impartial authority. Whispers fluttered across the rows of staff, fingers tapped nervously against laptops and notepads, and Marissa's legal team exchanged glances, calculating the next move in a rising chess game of legal strategy and moral exposure. Marissa's rebuttal was sharp, almost rehearsed, her tone laced with a subtle invocation of influence. "With all due respect, Your Honor, my father's experience in federal investigations ensures that proper protocols were followed. Surely his oversight carries weight in assessing the validity of the procedural steps taken." She paused, a faint smile curling as if to imply a quiet superiority, an expectation that status might bend the room to her favor. Judge Caprio's eyes, unflinching, met hers. "Ms. Reynolds, this court assesses actions, evidence, and consequences. Influence does not replace responsibility. Compliance is judged by conduct, not lineage." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspoken recognition that privilege could not shield her from scrutiny. Even the defense attorney's jaw tightened subtly, the room's equilibrium momentarily unsettled by the uncompromising statement. Tension escalated as Marissa pressed further, challenging procedural points with pointed questions, interruptions carefully timed to assert control. Each objection was met with measured counterpoints from the judge, who maintained composure as if every challenge only reinforced the principle that the law transcends personal stature. Fingers tapped, breaths were held, and the courtroom seemed to collectively sense that this was no ordinary legal dispute. This was a moral and psychological confrontation, a test of character played out in meticulously recorded dialogue and careful observation. Her family's unease became visible in micro-gestures, a hand brushing nervously against the armrest, a subtle shift in posture, glances exchanged that betrayed concern beneath the surface of social polish. Marissa's controlled demeanor began to show minute cracks, the narrowing of eyes, a brief hitch in her breathing, the quickening pulse evident in her throat. Even for someone raised in an environment of expectation and influence, the room's impartial scrutiny was exacting, and for the first time, she felt the weight of the public, moral, and legal gaze converge. The courtroom staff reacted in subtle ways. A stenographer paused slightly, pens hovering above notepads. A bailiff's jaw clenched beneath his composed exterior. Reporters leaned forward, sensing that Marissa's carefully curated confidence might finally meet its first real challenge. Each minor gesture amplified the tension, layering psychological pressure upon legal argument, pushing Marissa toward a precipice where arrogance would confront accountability. By mid-morning, the exchange had evolved into a study of contrasts, her entitlement flaring against the unyielding calm of Judge Caprio. Her interruptions and pointed inquiries became increasingly transparent in their intent, not to clarify, but to assert influence. Each response from the bench methodically dismantled that strategy, exposing the futility of relying on status over substance. A defining moment arrived when Marissa, exasperated, leaned forward and snapped, "So you're saying none of my father's oversight matters at all?" The courtroom held its breath, the question more than procedural. It was an emotional outcry, a realization of the limits of her inherited privilege. Judge Caprio's reply was quiet, deliberate, and carried the moral weight of the law. Miss Reynolds, oversight matters only when actions align with responsibility. What happened on February 18th is measured by consequences, not connections. Accountability cannot be inherited, it must be exercised. A soft pause filled the room, the words sinking deeper than any objection could. Marissa's posture stiffened, a fleeting flash of comprehension crossing her face, the first acknowledgement that authority, however esteemed, could not shield her from justice. The gallery murmured softly, the tension momentarily breaking, but replaced by a profound anticipation of what would come next, the moral reckoning that her privileges could not avert. As proceedings paused for a brief recess, the stage was unmistakably set. Marissa Reynolds had tested the limits of judicial patience and authority, her entitlement exposed against an unflinching legal and ethical standard. Every eye, every heartbeat in the room recognized that the coming chapters would strip away layers of arrogance and force a confrontation with the human and legal truths she had so far attempted to sidestep. Her challenge had been audacious, but the response had been clear. In this courtroom, status, influence, and reputation were secondary to accountability. And as Marissa returned to her seat, eyes lingering on the judge with a mixture of defiance and dawning apprehension, the first real cracks in her self-assured armor had begun to form. The courtroom fell into a hushed tension as the prosecution rose, a folder of meticulously organized evidence clutched in hand, each page a testament to precision and consequence. Tuesday, March 19th, 2024, 11:02 a.m. Courtroom 14C had become less a room and more a crucible, a space where privilege would collide with reality. Marissa Reynolds sat upright, her designer coat immaculate, her hands folded tightly in front of her, the faint tremor in her fingers betraying the confidence she had so far wielded like armor. The gallery leaned in, sensing the escalation, the moment where evidence would transcend argument, and moral clarity would pierce entitlement. Officer Daniel Perez, NYPD, cleared his throat and began presenting the facts with exacting precision. The drone in question fell from a height of 11.6 feet, impacting the cafe window on 7th Avenue at 5:47 p.m. on February 18, 2024. The nearest pedestrian, a toddler, aged 2 years and 11 months, was struck on the shoulder by debris, stopping 4 inches from his head. His words landed like measured blows. Marissa's jaw tightened, and her eyes flicked toward the defense team, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. The gallery shifted, the quiet punctuated only by the scratching of pens and the low hum of collective disbelief. The prosecutor continued, producing surveillance footage on a large screen. The camera captured the drone's erratic flight, its descent into chaos, and the subsequent panic, pedestrians scattering, the sharp crash of glass, screams overlapping as people stumbled backward. The room fell into near silence, the visceral images more damning than any spoken testimony. A single mother in the gallery shivered, recalling the sound of shards hitting the pavement, while a retired postal worker's hand gripped the edge of the bench, eyes distant as memory pulled him back into the event. Marissa's gaze faltered, the first clear cracks of unease appearing as she stared at the footage, a world of consequence stretching beyond curated Instagram posts and public appearances. Your Honor, the prosecutor's voice remained steady. We have documentation of permits rushed through city channels, warnings ignored, and safety protocols not enforced. Officer Perez stepped forward, pulling out engineering assessments, each diagram detailing angles, force vectors, and potential trajectories. Even a minor deviation could have resulted in severe injury or worse. These were not unforeseen risks. They were predictable and preventable. The courtroom absorbed the stark reality, precision, calculation, and yet the negligence remained, human error magnified by entitlement. Marissa's attorney interjected, a careful attempt to redirect focus. While the footage is compelling, the defendant followed the outlined protocols, Your Honor. Misfortune does not constitute negligence when procedures were in place. Marissa added, voice tight but sharp. I trust my father's professional guidance ensured proper oversight. The slight smile intended to exude control instead drew a cold glance from Judge Caprio. In this court, Judge Caprio replied evenly, intent does not absolve outcomes, and oversight without execution is insufficient. Ms. Reynolds, responsibility is measured by the tangible consequences of your actions, not the reputation of those around you. The words landed heavily. Marissa's shoulders shifted slightly, posture rigid, eyes momentarily cast downward as a flush of recognition crossed her face. Even for someone raised in an environment of influence and expectation, these were uncomfortable truths, impossible to navigate with charm or family name. Eyewitness testimony began. Maria Alvarez, the cafe owner, described the moment her window shattered. I ducked, but my assistant wasn't fast enough. Glass everywhere, customers screaming. I thought someone was seriously hurt. Her voice quivered not from performance, but from memory's raw edge. It could have been a child. It could have been anyone. And she just smiled after it happened. The room shifted. Reporters jotted furiously. Staff exchanged glances, and Marissa's fingers clenched and unclenched in a silent struggle against shame and defensiveness. Next, a retired postal worker, George Simmons, recounted the panic from the street corner. People were running, screaming. I've seen a lot in my time, but this was different. A drone falling from that height? Too close. Way too close. His testimony carried weight beyond technical detail. It humanized the consequences of recklessness, grounding the evidence in fear, disruption, and trauma. Attempts by the defense to downplay liability were systematically dismantled by the prosecutor, who cross-referenced permits, prior warnings, and documented internal communications. Each rebuttal exposed layers of negligence, gaps in preparation, reliance on status rather than accountability. Marissa shifted in her seat, hands now pressed against her knees, a subtle display of containment as the gallery bore witness to her growing discomfort. Her curated persona of confident entitlement was under siege by facts, images, and human testimony she could not charm or command. Judge Caprio's gaze swept the room, composed yet piercing. The evidence is comprehensive and leaves little room for interpretation. What happened on 7th Avenue was not an accident beyond control. It was a failure of preparation, judgment, and responsibility. Status and connections do not mitigate that failure. The silence that followed was pregnant, the courtroom collectively holding its breath as the moral gravity of the situation settled over every attendee. Marissa's eyes flickered to her legal team, searching for relief, a strategy to counterbalance the mounting weight of proof and human testimony. There was none. The gallery seemed to sense that this moment was pivotal. Privilege could no longer shield the defendant from accountability. The psychological pressure of confronting undeniable evidence was tangible. The moral imperative, clear, and the room collectively acknowledged the approaching reckoning. As the morning proceedings wound toward recess, the chapter of evidence beyond denial closed, leaving Marissa Reynolds facing a moral and legal crucible. Surveillance footage, technical reports, and personal testimony had stripped away illusions of immunity. In their place stood clarity. Actions have consequences, and accountability does not discriminate. The courtroom exhaled softly, the tension suspended like a held breath, preparing all present for the next phase of confrontation, where privilege would be tested against human cost and ethical responsibility. The hum of anticipation filled courtroom 14C as proceedings resumed on Tuesday, March 19, 2024, 1:37 p.m. Marissa Reynolds returned from recess with a tight smile and carefully composed posture, but the faint tremor in her fingers betrayed a growing awareness. Privilege was no longer sufficient armor. Reporters whispered into recorders, and court staff exchanged quiet nods, the subtle signals of a shift in energy rippling through the room. The case had entered a new phase, one where influence and entitlement would be scrutinized, dissected, and exposed, laying bare the mechanisms Marissa had relied upon to insulate herself from consequences. Prosecutors began methodically outlining attempts to manipulate the system. Internal communications reveal that calls were made to city officials, one stated, urging minimization of charges and subtle pressure applied to NYPD officers involved in the February 18th incident. A murmur ran through the gallery as Marissa's attorney's jaw tightened. Marissa herself shifted in her seat, hands folded in her lap, knuckles whitening. Her carefully maintained composure began to show fissures. Judge Caprio's gaze, steady and unwavering, met Marissa's, a silent but piercing question. Could she confront the truth or retreat into the shelter of her father's authority? Ms. Reynolds, he began, voice calm but edged with moral clarity, you appear to believe that connections, reputation, and influence can alter responsibility. This court does not operate on privilege, it operates on accountability. A slight cough echoed in the courtroom, and all eyes fixed on her, the weight of public and legal scrutiny converging in a single, inescapable moment. The prosecution continued, producing detailed records of calls to city officials, emails encouraging witnesses to soften statements, and notes from staff acknowledging pressure applied behind the scenes. Each piece of evidence illustrated a pattern, not an isolated misjudgment, but a consistent reliance on status as a shield. The gallery absorbed every word, tension thickening in the silence between statements. Every eye drawn to Marissa's subtle reactions. A tightening jaw, a fleeting avoidance of eye contact, a small trembling of her hands. Is it your position, Judge Caprio asked, that the weight of your father's office exempts you from the consequences of your actions? The question hung like a physical presence in the room. Marissa swallowed, a slight quiver in her voice as she attempted to respond. I never intended to. Her words faltered under the judge's unwavering stare. The gallery leaned forward, sensing a rupture in her composed exterior, a crack in the facade that had so far projected confidence, charm, and entitlement. A courtroom staff member whispered to a colleague, "She's finally realizing it." The comment went unnoticed by Marissa, but it punctuated the growing awareness that influence could no longer dictate outcome. Her legal team interjected, attempting to reframe the narrative, suggesting procedural misunderstandings or minor overstatements of pressure. Yet each rebuttal was met with Judge Caprio's careful dissection, exposing gaps, inconsistencies, and the moral implications of attempting to evade accountability through leverage. Marissa's father, FBI agent Thomas Reynolds, sat rigid in the gallery, face stoic, hands clasped tightly. Even he could not sway the legal reality forming before them. The courtroom observed the subtle psychological interplay, the daughter's pride colliding with impartial authority, the father's presence a reminder of the power she had sought to rely upon, and the moral compass of justice unyielding. The air was electric with anticipation and moral tension. Witnesses called to corroborate the manipulation testified under oath, their statements precise and emotionally resonant. One city official described feeling uneasy at the pressure applied, noting that procedural fairness seemed threatened. A police officer recounted a phone call in which hesitation to enforce standard citations was suggested, clearly influenced by Marissa's proximity to authority. Each revelation further dismantled her narrative of innocence, forcing the gallery and Marissa herself to confront the moral weight of her actions in her attempts to circumvent accountability. Judge Caprio's voice, calm yet resolute, carried over the courtroom's murmurs. Privilege is not a currency in this chamber. Influence is not a shield. The law does not bend for reputation, and morality does not bend for fear or status. Marissa shifted again, shoulders stiff, eyes darting to the floor, a subtle acknowledgement that her facade of control was crumbling. Her hands twitched slightly in her lap as she grappled internally with the realization that her carefully constructed persona could not survive the scrutiny of truth and conscience. The gallery sensed the apex of tension. Reporters scribbled furiously, courtroom staff exchanged glances that spoke volumes, and even members of the public leaned forward, silently witnessing the collision of privilege and principle. Marissa's composure faltered further as Judge Caprio methodically outlined the consequences of her attempts to exploit influence, drawing a clear line between entitlement and responsibility. Each word was a mirror held up to her actions, reflecting the moral failures behind the technical missteps of the drone incident. As the chapter approached its conclusion, Marissa's transformation began. Not yet redemption, but the first recognition of vulnerability. Her gaze softened, her breathing slowed, and the rigid posture eased ever so slightly. The courtroom absorbed the profound lesson being unfolded. Privilege offers no immunity, power does not excuse negligence, and moral exposure can precede legal judgment. Observers sensed that a pivotal turning point had been reached, one that would guide the subsequent confrontation with human consequence and accountability. With the evidence of privilege fully unraveled, the stage was set for Marissa Reynolds to face the true measure of her actions, not through law alone, but through the moral imperative that demanded acknowledgement, restitution, and transformation. The next chapter would bring the victims forward, forcing her to confront the human cost and the tangible weight of her negligence, bridging the distance between entitlement and accountability. The room fell into a hush as 10-year-old Ethan Liu stepped forward, his small frame trembling ever so slightly under the weight of the moment. February 18th, 2024, a day that had begun like any other, now lived vividly in his memory. The sudden whir of a drone, a flash of metal in the winter sunlight, the piercing sound of shattered glass. "I was scared because someone thought this was fun," he said quietly. Yet each word cut through the tension like a blade, slicing away the protective veneer Marissa Reynolds had clung to. The courtroom absorbed the truth in that simple statement, the innocence of a child juxtaposed starkly against a life steeped in privilege. Marissa's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair as Ethan's words echoed. She had prepared for technical defenses, procedural loopholes, even character witnesses. She had not prepared for this raw, moral indictment delivered with quiet clarity. A glance toward her father revealed his stoic presence. Hands folded, lips pressed thin, his badge, his reputation, could not shield her from this confrontation. The gallery, reporters, and staff felt the collective inhale, the silent acknowledgement that the collision of recklessness and human consequence had arrived. Mrs. Alvarez, the owner of the shattered cafe on 7th Avenue, rose next. Her hands bore the faint tremor of nerves, her eyes red-rimmed from stress. She recounted the immediate aftermath. "I heard the crash and ran outside. My window was gone, glass everywhere. My employees were terrified. Customers panicked. We lost 2 days of income while repairs were made, and the fear, my staff still flinch when drones pass overhead." Her voice, calm yet resolute, resonated with the courtroom, each syllable a testimony to the tangible harm Marissa's actions had inflicted. There was no room for denial here, no technicality to hide behind. Officer Daniel Perez returned to the stand, detailing not only the precision of the near miss, but the negligence leading up to it. The drone had fallen 11.6 feet, stopping just 4 inches from the toddler's head, causing $22,350 in property damage. Staff had ignored warnings, permits had been rushed, and oversight had been minimal. The cumulative evidence painted a picture of recklessness underpinned by entitlement. Marissa's carefully curated facade of competence crumbling under the weight of factual clarity. Marissa's lawyer attempted to interject, offering mitigating context, citing procedural adherence in the unintentional nature of the incident. Marissa opened her mouth, voice steady at first. We followed protocols. Everything was... Her words faltered as she caught Ethan's gaze, the unflinching innocence reflecting the truth she had avoided acknowledging. Silence hung thick in the air. Even her legal team faltered, realizing that this confrontation transcended legal argument. It was now a reckoning of conscience. A deep, quiet shift occurred in her posture. Her shoulders slumped imperceptibly, and the confidence in her smile faded, replaced by an unspoken weight of recognition. The court could sense it. Marissa Reynolds, accustomed to being shielded by influence and reputation, was confronting the immediate human consequences of her choices. Her eyes traced the shards of glass on the floor, as if seeing, perhaps for the first time, the literal and symbolic damage left in her wake. Judge Caprio's voice, calm and deliberate, cut through the tension. Responsibility is measured not in wealth or position, but in the impact of one's actions on those around you. You are now being asked to confront the consequences, not as a reflection of your status, but as a reflection of your humanity. Marissa's eyes met his, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. She had expected a courtroom procedural dance, a game of legal chess. Instead, she faced moral accountability in its purest form. Tears welled as Marissa finally spoke, her voice soft, unsteady, carrying both remorse and recognition. I am so sorry. I never meant to hurt anyone. I want to make this right. She began listing concrete steps: funding therapy for affected children, sponsoring community safety programs, personal apologies to those harmed. Her voice gained strength as the words became commitments, bridging the gap between privilege and tangible restitution. It was not performative. It was the beginning of an emotional transformation, the first acknowledgement that consequence was real and personal. Ethan nodded slightly, a gesture small but significant, while Mrs. Alvarez's expression softened, the courtroom collectively witnessing the shift from denial to accountability. The gallery remained silent, absorbing the moral gravity, sensing that the legal narrative was now inseparable from human impact. Marissa's tears, the trembling acknowledgement of responsibility, and the careful articulation of restitution created an emotional apex, a turning point where law and morality converged. As the chapter drew to a close, the courtroom felt the quiet power of accountability taking root. Marissa Reynolds, confronted directly with those she had harmed, began the delicate work of reckoning with her own actions. The moral weight of February 18, 2024 was no longer abstract. It was carried in the eyes of a child, the voice of a business owner, and the silent acknowledgement of every witness present. This confrontation set the stage for the forthcoming judgment, where justice would be rendered not merely in fines and sentences, but in moral clarity, shaping the path toward restitution and eventual transformation. The courtroom was hushed, the tension almost tangible, as Judge Caprio cleared his throat and allowed the weight of the moment to settle over everyone present. March 12, 2024, 10 minutes past 11 a.m., had arrived, the time when law, morality, and consequence would converge. Marissa Reynolds sat rigid in her chair, her designer coat folded neatly over her lap, hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her father, FBI agent Thomas Reynolds, sat stoically beside her, eyes fixed on the judge. But even he could not shield his daughter from the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The gallery, reporters, community members, and the families of victims leaned forward in anticipation, silent witnesses to a reckoning that was as much ethical as it was legal. Judge Caprio's voice carried, measured and unwavering. Marissa Reynolds, the charges brought against you are not abstract. They are reflections of tangible harm inflicted upon innocent individuals. The law is clear. Your actions on February 18, 2024, violated public safety, endangered life, and caused substantial property damage. Yet the law does not exist merely to punish. It exists to restore, to educate, and to prevent future harm. The words hung in the air like an electric charge, each syllable a mirror reflecting the severity of her decisions. Marissa's eyes flickered briefly toward Ethan Liu and Mrs. Alvarez, both seated quietly, their expressions unreadable but heavy with the quiet dignity of those wronged. The judge paused, letting the courtroom absorb the gravity. This court recognizes your age, your background, and the privilege that surrounds you. But no badge, no lineage, no wealth exempts any citizen from accountability. In this courtroom, responsibility is absolute. A ripple ran through the gallery. Whispers were stifled, eyes darted, and Marissa's fingers trembled imperceptibly. Her previously confident demeanor was replaced by a delicate veneer of humility, though it was unpracticed, raw, and vulnerable. He continued, outlining the sentence with meticulous clarity. You will pay restitution totaling $150,000, which includes direct compensation to affected parties and repair of property damage during your drone demonstration. You will attend and actively participate in community safety programs for a period of 6 months. You will be subject to quarterly compliance monitoring by the court to ensure accountability and measurable progress. Beyond these financial and procedural mandates, you are required to engage directly with those impacted. You will teach drone safety and public responsibility workshops in local schools, mentor youth in civic awareness, and contribute to programs designed to prevent incidents such as this. The courtroom absorbed each word, a collective recognition that justice was being applied with both precision and moral intent. Marissa's eyes filled with tears. The carefully cultivated armor of entitlement had no place here. For the first time, she felt the full weight of her actions, not just as abstract violations, but as disruptions of lives. Her breath came in shallow, uneven increments as the words sank in. Her father reached over, pressing a steady hand on her shoulder, an unspoken gesture of support. But even he could not absolve her. The consequences were hers alone. Ethan Liu, seated with his mother, watched quietly as Marissa lowered her gaze, absorbing the sentences not as figures on paper, but as commitments to the people she had harmed. The boy's earlier statement, simple yet piercing in its clarity, resonated in the silence. I was scared because someone thought this was fun. The words had not left the room when the implications of the verdict landed fully. Her restitution would now involve daily engagement, repeated effort, direct accountability. Justice was no longer theoretical. It was practical, immediate, and emotionally resonant. The judge's eyes, calm yet piercing, met Marissa's. This is a court of both law and conscience. Your punishment is designed not only to recompense the damages done, but to cultivate understanding, empathy, and responsibility. You will see the consequences of your choices firsthand. Your journey toward making amends begins today. The precision of the sentence, combined with its moral weight, elicited a visible shiver among those present. This was a verdict that transcended legal formality, embedding ethical reckoning into the very fabric of its application. Marissa swallowed hard, tears spilling freely now, a release she had avoided throughout the proceedings. She nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her new reality. Words failed her, but the intent in her gaze, toward Ethan, Mrs. Alvarez, and the community that had borne witness, was unmistakable. This was no longer an exercise in image management. It was the initiation of tangible accountability. As the courtroom began to stir, the silence returned, heavy but purposeful. Marissa's transformation would not be instantaneous, and yet the seeds of change had been sown. The verdict demanded presence, effort, and humility, a practical education in moral responsibility. Observers whispered among themselves, recognizing a rare convergence of punitive and restorative justice. The elegance of a sentence that did not merely punish, but illuminated the ethical consequences of actions and invited redemption through deliberate, meaningful effort. As the gavel struck, signaling the formal conclusion of the judgment, a subtle shift moved through the room. Shock and humiliation registered on Marissa's face, yet beneath them, there was a faint glimmer of comprehension and acceptance of what justice required. Judge Caprio's measured authority contrasted starkly with the raw vulnerability before him, a silent lesson in the equilibrium between power, consequence, and morality. The room remained silent for a long beat, collectively absorbing the weight of justice that had been both delivered and exemplified. Marissa's path forward, fraught with accountability, engagement, and moral reckoning, had begun in earnest. The first light of dawn cut through the gray Manhattan sky, sprinkling faint gold across the wet pavement as Marissa Reynolds stepped out of her apartment building, coffee in one hand, a worn notebook in the other. The winter chill bit at her designer coat, but today it was irrelevant. Fatigue and anticipation coursed through her in equal measure. 6 months had passed since Judge Caprio's sentence, and every morning now began with the same reality. Accountability was not a theoretical concept. It was a daily, unyielding obligation. She walked with a purposeful slowness, aware that every step was observed by students, parents, and the community members she had once disregarded. Skepticism hung in the air like mist. Some still remembered the drone crash, the chaos on 7th Avenue, the terror in children's eyes. But today, Marissa was not stepping into a courtroom to defend herself. She was stepping into a school gymnasium, tasked with teaching a safety workshop on drone operation and public responsibility. The room was already filled with children, some hesitant, some curious, their parents hovering at the edges, murmuring questions about her presence. Marissa's palms were clammy as she set her bag down, opened her notebook, and met the eyes of Ethan Liu, now taller, braver, yet still carrying the memory of that fateful February day. He gave a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement that this was part of her journey, and she responded with a tight-lipped smile. The adults in the room whispered among themselves, their gazes a mixture of doubt and cautious hope. Marissa had learned quickly that words alone could not earn trust. Every gesture, every instruction, every moment of patience would now carry the weight of redemption. "Good morning, everyone," she began, voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "Today we're going to learn about drones, not just how to fly them, but how to respect the people and spaces around us." Her words were simple, practical, but carried a resonance she had never fully understood before. She demonstrated pre-flight safety checks, emphasized distance from pedestrians, and narrated real-life scenarios drawn from her own mistakes. She felt the eyes on her, the silent judgment, and let it guide her focus. Every careful step of the demonstration was a statement. Responsibility was not optional, and accountability was not negotiable. During a hands-on exercise, Marissa walked among the children, correcting grips, offering encouragement, answering questions. She noticed small gestures of acceptance, a smile from a parent who had previously scowled, a hesitant hand raised in curiosity from a child who had once been terrified of drones. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she moved from station to station, her energy expended not in maintaining image, but in fostering understanding. She recalled the judge's words about direct engagement with those harmed. This was it, living proof of moral restitution, layered atop the legal framework. Her own reflection in the polished floor mirrored fatigue, humility, and, surprisingly, a glimmer of genuine purpose. Later, she visited Mrs. Alvarez's cafe to discuss repair work and restitution programs. The shop smelled of fresh coffee and pastries, a warm contrast to the cold exposure of the courtroom months prior. Mrs. Alvarez met her at the door, eyes cautiously watchful. "I've been following your progress," she said softly, voice carrying both curiosity and lingering doubt. Marissa nodded, hands folded, listening. "I know it's been hard," Mrs. Alvarez continued, "but seeing you here, taking this seriously, it matters. Not just for me, but for the kids, for the community." Marissa's throat tightened. She had rehearsed responses countless times, but none could prepare her for the weight of sincerity in those words. Community programs, workshops, and mentoring sessions consumed her days. Rain, snow, early mornings, conditions once dismissed as inconsequential, now became proving grounds for endurance, patience, and moral growth. Her parents observed from a distance, pride tempered with lingering concern, while her peers and school administrators began to note the subtle shift. Marissa's initial awkwardness evolved into competence. Her occasional mistakes became teachable moments, shared openly with transparency. Gradually, the collective skepticism softened. Parents expressed quiet approval, children asked questions that went beyond curiosity to understanding, and educators recognized the transformation as substantive, not performative. Evenings were spent reflecting on the day, logging incidents, evaluating responses, and planning for the next session. Sleep came reluctantly, yet each day reinforced the lesson Judge Caprio had delivered. Redemption was earned, not granted. The repetition of accountability, the tangible connection to those she had harmed, and the consistency of her engagement were reshaping her understanding of privilege and responsibility. She began to internalize humility, not as a social mask, but as a lived reality. By the sixth month, Marissa's presence in the community was no longer met solely with skepticism. She was a recognizable figure in the schools, in local programs, and at public safety events. She had learned to anticipate the consequences of actions before they occurred, to consider the human impact of every decision. Her reflection in a cafe window revealed someone changed, not only legally compliant, but morally and emotionally aligned with the expectations Judge Caprio had articulated. Redemption, she now understood, was a long, demanding process, but one that yielded profound personal transformation when approached with sincerity and effort. The chapter of early mornings, persistent engagement, and measured humility concluded not with applause or public accolades, but with quiet acknowledgement that trust is rebuilt slowly, one responsible act at a time, and that the most powerful lessons are absorbed through lived experience, not lecture. Marissa Reynolds was no longer simply the daughter of a high-ranking FBI agent. She was a young woman beginning to reconcile privilege with accountability, power with responsibility, and mistake with meaningful restitution. The ripples of one fateful drone incident had stretched far beyond the initial chaos on 7th Avenue, touching lives, schools, and neighborhoods in ways no one could have predicted. By the time Marissa Reynolds completed her 6 months of intensive community service, the landscape of public trust, safety awareness, and moral accountability had begun to shift perceptibly. Children who once recoiled at the mere mention of drones now approached her with tentative questions, eager to understand, to learn, to engage. Ethan Liu, no longer just the small boy whose tablet had been destroyed, now demonstrated a cautious curiosity, asking insightful questions about flight safety and public responsibility. His voice, still carrying traces of the fear from that February afternoon, had matured into one of critical moral observation. So if someone is in charge, it doesn't mean they can ignore what's dangerous? It was the kind of question that forced Marissa and the adults around her to reckon with the profound implications of privilege and oversight. At the cafe on 7th Avenue, Mrs. Alvarez had rebuilt her window, the cracks replaced with reinforced glass, a physical reminder of what had occurred and what had been repaired. Her business had recovered, in part due to the restitution funds Marissa had directed towards safety improvements and community programs. But it wasn't just the repairs that mattered. It was the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, the visible presence of accountability, and the slow restoration of trust. I didn't know if she'd ever understand, Mrs. Alvarez admitted during an interview with a local journalist. But watching her show up every day, sweating through lessons, talking to kids about respect and safety, I saw it. She's learning what we all wish people in power would understand sooner. Across the city, school administrators and parents were incorporating lessons learned from the case into broader safety protocols. A once-ignored safety checklist became mandatory before any public demonstration, drone operation, or experimental activity involving minors. Local teachers spoke of integrating not only technical guidance, but moral instruction, framing every lesson in the context of responsibility and foresight. Students who had observed the media coverage 6 months earlier now had the opportunity to discuss ethics, accountability, and privilege in real-world contexts. The community, once shaken and wary, began to understand that true safety was as much about moral vigilance as it was about physical precautions. Journalists continued to follow Marissa's progress, not with prying curiosity, but with a sense of documenting a rare narrative arc. Accountability followed by consistent, tangible action. Articles highlighted her daily routines, arriving before sunrise to set up workshops, mentoring children through complex tasks, and engaging with families in honest dialogue about past mistakes. Law students and ethics scholars dissected her transformation, using the case as a living example of restorative justice in practice. Social media, once quick to amplify ridicule, began posting measured observations, praising her steadfast commitment, and noting how rare it was for a privileged individual to embrace sustained responsibility so fully. The community's healing was gradual but unmistakable. Families of victims reported not only tangible compensation, but emotional closure. Children who had witnessed panic and near injury developed resilience, their fears mitigated by consistent reassurance, structured guidance, and the presence of someone visibly accountable for prior harm. Parents reflected that the lesson extended beyond safety. It was about integrity, the consequences of unchecked influence, and the power of redemption through earnest effort. Conversations in cafes, playgrounds, and PTA meetings began to shift. People debated responsibility not as a theoretical concept, but as lived experience, informed by the case and Marissa's continued engagement. Marissa herself noticed subtle changes in her own perception. The smug confidence she once relied upon had been replaced by an awareness of relational accountability. She understood, viscerally, that actions resonated beyond the immediate moment, that privilege could accelerate opportunities but never erase consequences. Her daily log, initially a perfunctory exercise for compliance monitoring, became a reflection of growth. She recorded mistakes, miscommunications, and successes, analyzing each for lessons learned and for how her influence could be repurposed toward community benefit. Humility became habitual, not performative, and empathy, once abstract, now had practical expression. Months after the initial incident, local schools invited her to speak at assemblies, not as a figure of notoriety, but as a model of personal transformation. The talks were candid. She recounted the near miss, the fear she caused, the emotional toll on children and adults alike. She emphasized that safety was a shared responsibility and that moral courage often demanded confronting one's own failures. In these moments, she no longer sought validation. She observed the silent reflection in her audience, the slow nods, the questions that probed moral understanding rather than technical skill. The classroom became an extension of the courtroom, a space where authority was measured not in status, but in ethical conduct and consistent action. As Marissa's consistency became evident, public perception shifted. Skepticism gave way to cautious respect. Parents and educators, once wary, began inviting her into broader initiatives, citywide safety campaigns, youth mentorship programs, and collaborative ethics workshops. Her transformation became a case study in the media, in legal circles, and in educational forums. It was no longer about a single misjudged stunt. It was about the rippling consequences of accountability embraced and redemption actively pursued. Reflecting on the arc of the past year, the philosophical weight of Judge Caprio's guidance resonated clearly. Justice had not been merely punitive. It had been instructive, moral, and transformative. By confronting the consequences of her privilege, engaging directly with those she had harmed, and consistently demonstrating responsibility, Marissa Reynolds had illustrated that the measure of justice is not found solely in verdicts and fines, but in the social and ethical lessons absorbed by both offender and community. Public trust, fragile and conditional, had been restored not through words or status, but through sustained, visible action that aligned moral responsibility with lived experience. The city's narrative, once dominated by scandal and fear, had evolved into one of learning and reflection. Children understood that rules were meaningful, not arbitrary. Parents understood that oversight and guidance were essential. Law and ethics students could study a tangible example of restorative justice applied in a complex real-world scenario. Journalists found a story that transcended sensationalism, demonstrating that accountability, humility, and consistent effort could genuinely transform perceptions and lives. In the end, the case of Marissa Reynolds left the community with an enduring lesson. Privilege may offer opportunity, but it cannot substitute for responsibility. Mistakes may cause harm, but they can catalyze growth when confronted directly. And justice, when paired with moral reckoning and tangible action, can ripple outward, shaping not only the individual, but the entire society they touch. The echoes of February 18, 2024, were no longer solely of fear and chaos. They now carried the resonance of accountability, redemption, and the power of consistent ethical action, leaving a legacy that would inform generations to come. The classroom at Jefferson Elementary smelled faintly of crayons and floor polish, a place usually alive with the hum of small voices now quieted by careful attention. Marissa Reynolds stood before a group of wide-eyed fifth graders, a clipboard in one hand and the weight of months of accountability in the other. Outside, the late afternoon sun had begun to spill gold over Madison Avenue, its glow catching in the scratches and dents of the once shattered cafe window she had helped repair months prior. The street outside had transformed as well. Community murals dedicated to safety initiatives, banners for after-school programs, and small plaques acknowledging those who had contributed to local civic responsibility. Marissa's presence in these halls, once a symbol of privilege unchecked, now resonated with the consequence of her actions and the persistence of her redemption. She spoke quietly, her voice steady but reflective. Safety isn't just rules, it's respect for the people around us. When we ignore warnings, when we assume our influence protects us, someone else bears the cost. The children listened, some nodding thoughtfully, others exchanging glances, perhaps recognizing the gravity in her tone. Behind her, a group of educators observed, initially skeptical, now leaning slightly forward, acknowledging that the lessons extended beyond lesson plans. They carried lived experience. At home, Ethan Liu's mother, Maria, read the latest local paper with a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. Headlines chronicled Marissa's workshops, highlighting her direct engagement with students and her presence at community events. "She's following through," Maria whispered to Ethan, whose small hand still bore the faint scar from the February incident. "She's not just words this time." Ethan glanced up, eyes wide, the memory of fear lingering but slowly being replaced by a tentative trust. "I think she gets it," he said softly, and for the first time since that day, the tremor of panic was replaced by comprehension. Accountability can be more than a sentence. It can be a change. Journalists and law students had begun compiling reports, case studies, and ethical analyses. The story of the FBI agent's daughter had become a cautionary tale, not of wealth-shielding misconduct, but of how societal trust can be restored through genuine action. In lecture halls at NYU and Columbia, professors presented Marissa's arc as a demonstration of legal clarity paired with moral courage. Questions arose in class discussions. How does one rebuild credibility? How can communities hold the privileged accountable without escalating harm? The answers emerged from months of sustained effort, from measured apologies and structured mentorship, from visible humility in public spaces. Marissa herself, during these weeks, felt the subtle yet persistent weight of observation. Every misstep was noted, every delayed response to a child's question scrutinized. She arrived at workshops before sunrise, winter wind biting at her face, and stayed long after others left, setting up equipment, checking lists, reviewing protocols. The fatigue was physical, but the reflection was internal. She remembered Judge Caprio's gaze, steady and unyielding, the silence after his pronouncement, the quiet yet piercing moral expectation that accompanied every word he spoke in court. Those moments, once abstract, now resonated in her actions. Each instruction she gave to students about responsibility and foresight echoed her own months of self-reckoning. In the cafe where she had once caused chaos, Mrs. Alvarez now greeted her with a nod, small but laden with acknowledgement. Repairs were complete, safety measures reinforced, and patrons had returned, their chatter no longer punctuated by apprehension. Marissa's workshops on drone safety had expanded into broader discussions on public awareness, technology, and respect for shared spaces. Children asked questions, parents took notes, and teachers smiled quietly at the shift in tone. From fear to engagement, from recklessness to learning. It was tangible proof that accountability, when undertaken sincerely, rippled outward beyond a single courtroom or one individual's guilt. The city itself, in subtle ways, had begun to absorb the lesson. Street signage now reminded residents of safety protocols in public tech demonstrations. Schools incorporated procedural drills for minor hazards. Local news segments highlighted community participation in preventing accidents. Each of these small acknowledgments was a collective reinforcement of responsibility, an understanding that laws are not abstract and privilege is not a shield. Marissa's evolution became a narrative woven into this civic tapestry, one of humility earned, respect regained, and empathy practiced. At the heart of it, Marissa's personal transformation illuminated a broader truth. Justice is not only about the fine print of statutes or the weight of a gavel. It is measured in restored trust, in visible deeds, in the emotional and moral education of those affected. The quiet nod from a teacher, the tentative smile from a child who once trembled in fear, the cautious approval from parents who once doubted, all these became as significant as the legal sentence itself. She realized that the moral ledger of society extends beyond the courtroom, beyond monetary fines, into the daily interactions, visible accountability, and repeated efforts to do right where wrong had once occurred. Even months later, when winter gave way to spring, Marissa's presence continued to spark conversation and reflection. Local law. Students debated ethical dilemmas inspired by her case. Neighborhood forums discussed the balance between privilege and responsibility. Community leaders cited her example when designing youth engagement programs. And Marissa herself, now accustomed to the rhythm of service, understood a profound truth. Accountability is not a singular act, but a continuous choice, a commitment to live under the shadow of one's own mistakes until trust is fully earned. The story, once a headline of scandal and entitlement, had become a narrative of growth, of societal education, and of justice measured not solely in law, but in human consequence. It left those who had observed it, students, families, colleagues, and strangers, reflecting on the interplay of power and humility. They understood that while anyone can wield influence, true responsibility demands courage, consistency, and the willingness to confront one's own failings without retreat. Justice in this sense was not final in a gavel's echo, but ongoing in the measured steps of a young woman who had learned, finally, to carry the weight of her actions with awareness, empathy, and unwavering commitment. As sunlight faded over Madison Avenue, the city seemed quieter, steadier, more attentive. Lessons learned in a single courtroom had permeated streets, schools, homes, and hearts. And in that quiet, persistent change, Marissa Reynolds' journey stood as a testament. That privilege can be transformed by accountability, that mistakes can become instruments of growth, and that the moral fabric of a community is strengthened not only by law, but by the enduring impact of personal responsibility and sustained ethical action.